Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really pressing issue for small and medium-sized manufacturing businesses right where you are. We're looking at the growing impact of recent U.S. tariff policies and, crucially, the smart moves these businesses, well, maybe need to be thinking about right now.
Absolutely. We're digging into some really interesting materials today. They're from a KPMG seminar held around April of 2025, so pretty current stuff. And it wasn't just a general overview, it was laser focused really on the specific US tariffs and the kind of strategic adaptations needed, especially for Taiwanese businesses. We've got insights from both KPMG China and the US team, which gives us a really timely, on the ground perspective. Things are changing fast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're listening and you run a manufacturing business in Taiwan, or maybe you're involved somewhere in that supply chain, or even if you're just trying to get your head around these big shifts in global trade,
Yeah.
this deep dive is really designed to give you the essential knowledge. We're going to try and unpack the complexities and maybe more importantly, highlight the practical steps you could consider. Okay, so let's start by getting a handle on this new tariff landscape. What are we looking at?
Well, the seminar materials make it pretty clear. The driving force seems to be the trade policy framework let out during Trump's campaign. The core ideas are really about increasing tariffs, putting up more trade barriers,
Right.
trying to encourage manufacturing to come back to the U.S., the whole reshoring idea, and also significantly kind of reshaping the global trade order. Plus, there's a specific aim to restrict China's technological development.
And the numbers involved, they're not small, are they? We're talking potentially a base tariff of 10 to 20% on, well, most foreign goods. But then it gets really interesting when you look at China specifically. A potential jump to 60%? And some sources even mentioned extreme scenarios, maybe 150, even 200% tariffs on Chinese goods. That's huge.
It is. And on top of that, there's talk of a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico. It suggests this idea of reciprocal tariffs might be applied more broadly, the pressure to really rethink supply chains, maybe move away from China, possibly towards the US. It's definitely building.
So what's the rationale behind all this, according to the materials?
Well, it's presented from a few angles. There's the argument, that the US dollar has been overvalued for a long time, and that's hurt US manufacturing competitiveness, contributed to trade deficits.
The Magi angle.
Exactly. The Make America Great Again idea is clearly centered on bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. But they also frame tariffs as a potential source of government revenue and a tool for negotiation in trade deals.
And this isn't just talk, is it? There's a timeline of actions from early 2025 that really shows things moving quickly.
Yeah, definitely. The seminar laid out a sequence. So you had the U.S. imposing a 10% tariff on all goods. That was February 4th and again on March 4th.
Okay, a broad start.
Then, around February 10th, specific tariffs 10 to 15% hit things like major commodities, agricultural machinery, large vehicles,
Right.
followed by major agricultural products around March 10th.
And the key thing here is the response, the back and forth.
Absolutely crucial. China retaliated with its own escalating tariffs. It got up to 84% on all goods by April 8th and 10th,
Wow, 84%.
and then jumped again just days later, April 9th and 11th, to 125% on all goods. The seminar materials really stress that these U.S. tariffs are fundamentally framed as, targeting China.
That rapid escalation, 84 to 125% in days, it just highlights the volatility, doesn't it? Businesses really need contingency plans.
No question. It's a fast-moving situation.
What's interesting, though, is that U.S. reliance on imports from China had already been going down even before these latest moves.
That's right. Even with tariffs from the first Trump term, which were largely kept or even expanded by Biden, imports from China dropped from about 21% of total U.S. imports in 2016 down to 13% more recently.
Still a big imbalance, though. U.S. imports from China dwarfs the exports going the other way.
Definitely. And if you look at the 2024 data, you can see which Chinese sectors really depended on that U.S. market. It was about 32% of China's exports to the U.S.
Which sectors are we talking about?
It's quite a mix. You've got things like furniture, bedding, sporting goods, toys, plastic products, lamps, lighting, apparel, bags, shoes, textiles. Then a big chunk in consumer electronics. Mobile phones, digital cameras, game consoles, computers.
Okay, so lots of consumer-facing stuff.
Yeah, and also lithium batteries, pharmaceuticals, home appliances, medical equipment, auto parts, steel products, so some labor-intensive goods, lots of electronics, and other industrial items. And since Taiwanese manufacturers are big players in many of those electronics areas, laptops, telecom gear, you can see the immediate pressure. It hits their margins, their price competitiveness in the U.S.
Right. And the impact on specific goods must be huge, making Chinese goods way more expensive for Americans and U.S. goods pricier in China.
Exactly. Think about the top exports. U.S. sends soybeans, aircraft, integrated circuits, pharma, oil to China. China sends smartphones, laptops, batteries, toys, telecom equipment to the U.S. Tariffs just add costs all around, hitting prices in both places.
And it's not just tariffs, right? There were
That-
other measures involved.
Good point.
Right.
Non-tariff measures are also part of the picture. China, for instance, controls a lot of the refining for critical metals, copper, lithium, rare earths. That gives them leverage. We've seen them use export restrictions before on things like germanium and gallium. And the U.S. side, well, there are the tech blockades, like restricting advanced microchip exports. Plus, there's the potential for the U.S. to pressure other countries, maybe Cambodia, Mexico, Vietnam, to limit their trade with China if they want continued good access to the U.S. market.
Wow. So all this turbulence, it must be hitting the financial markets.
Oh, definitely. The seminar materials highlighted increased risk aversion, more uncertainty. They pointed to the VIX index, the volatility index spiking around early April 2025.
So markets getting jittery.
Yeah, and global stock markets reacted differently. Some were up, some were down around that time, April 8th. You saw gold, Hang Seng, markets in Mexico, Germany, Korea, Vietnam, Paris, Mumbai, showing some positive signs, actually. But others, like Shanghai, broader European indices, the Dow, S&P 500, NASDAQ, Tokyo, they were down.
It really paints a picture of widespread concern, doesn't it? About trade stability, supply chains, potential disruptions. It's more than just numbers, it's the underlying feeling.
Absolutely. It reflects a real unease. So that sets the stage. Maybe we should shift now to how businesses are actually trying to respond strategically,
Right.
looking back at the first Trump term and what's being considered now.
Right, because businesses didn't just sit still during the first round of tariffs, did they? What were the common strategies then?
Well, a common tactic back then, especially for multinationals, was trying to get around the China tariffs by shifting some processing steps,
Huh?
moving final assembly maybe to Southeast Asia or Latin America.
The country of origin shuffle.
Exactly. The idea was to change where the goods were officially declared as originating from. A classic example was Chinese solar panel makers moving assembly to places like Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam.
But the U.S. caught on to that, didn't they?
They did. The U.S. response has been to consider what are called countervailing duties on goods from those third countries, basically trying to close that loophole. And that renewed focus is a big reason why this idea of restructuring value chains feels even more urgent now in what some are calling the Trump 2.0 era.
Makes sense. So what else is driving this urgency now?
Well, a few things mentioned in the seminar. One is just increased scrutiny from U.S. customs on anything potentially linked to China, higher inspection rates, more potential delays.
Yeah.
Another is that U.S. customers are increasingly asking for DDP terms, delivered duty paid.
Right, meaning the seller handles all the costs and risks, including the import duties, to get the goods to the buyer's door.
Precisely. Which really squeezes the pricing power of the exporters, often those in China or using Chinese components. And then, of course, the sheer scale of the potential new tariffs on all Chinese goods. That possibility of another 20% on top of the existing 25%, maybe even hitting 50% later, that's a massive driver for change.
Okay, so the pressure is immense. What are the specific tactics businesses are looking at based on the seminar?
They outline several key strategies. The first bucket is tariff planning, and it's really focused on managing the import customs value, the value the duty is calculated on. And a really important technique here is something called first sale for export.
First sale for export. Okay, break that down for us.
Right. So this is a specific valuation method allowed by U.S. Customs based on an old court ruling. Basically, instead of using the price the U.S. importer pays the middleman, you might be able to use the earlier price, the price the original manufacturer sold the goods for, to that middleman, but only if that first sale was clearly intended for export directly to the U.S.
Okay, let's try an example. Say a U.S. company buys widgets from a trading company for $100 each.
Right.
But that trading company actually bought them from the factory in, say, Taiwan for $90. And everyone knew those specific widgets were destined for the U.S. market right from that first $90 sale.
Exactly. Under the first sale rule, the import duty, let's say it's 25%, could potentially be calculated on that $90 factory price, not the $100 the U.S. importer paid.
So 25% of $90 instead of 25% of $100. That's a real saving per widget.
It can be significant, yeah. But, and this is a big but, there are strict requirements.
Okay, what are they?
First, that initial sale, the $90 one in your example, has to be a genuine bona fide transaction. Both the factory and the middleman have to actually take ownership and assume risk at different points.
Makes sense.
Second, the goods have to be clearly destined for the U.S. at the time of that first sale. It can't be decided later, usually means they ship pretty directly. Third, the price between the factory and the middleman needs to be fair, what customs calls an arm's length price, not artificially low just to save duties.
Arm's length, okay. How do they test that?
Customs looks at a few things. Is the price similar to what the factory charges other unrelated buyers? Does it align with normal pricing practices in that industry? Does it cover all the factory's costs plus a reasonable profit? They also have definitions for who counts as a related party: family ties, shared company directors, partners, significant ownership stakes, employer-employee relationships. Transactions between related parties get extra scrutiny.
And the last requirement you mentioned earlier, documentation.
Absolutely critical. You need meticulous records to prove everything. Purchase orders, invoices for both the first sale and the second sale, proof of payment, shipping documents like bills of lading showing the destination, contracts, potentially emails or other correspondence showing the intent for U.S. export.
Wow, it sounds like a lot of paperwork.
It is. You need a really robust system to track it all. The seminar materials mention different ways. First sale can be structured too. Sometimes it's for finished goods. Sometimes it might be structured around the sale of, say, assembly services provided by the Taiwanese vendor.
The assembly services model sounds like it might need even more careful documentation.
Potentially, yes. You have to clearly define what's being sold. The materials also warn about pitfalls, like so-called flash sales, where the ownership transfers happen almost simultaneously. That can raise red flags. The key is demonstrating that first sale was real, separate, and clearly for U.S. export.
Okay, so first sale for export is one major tactic under tariff planning. What else is mentioned?
Another option discussed was using a non-resident importer, or NRI structure.
Non-resident importer.
Yeah. This is where a foreign company, maybe the seller or manufacturer, acts as the official importer into the U.S., even though they don't have a physical presence there. It's another way that, depending on the specifics of the transaction and pricing, might allow for a lower declared value for customs purposes. The example in the material showed potential tariff savings compared to a more standard setup.
Interesting. And then there was cost unbundling. What's that about?
This one's about trying to reduce the dutiable value by identifying and separating out certain costs that aren't directly part of producing the goods or costs incurred after importation.
Okay, like what?
Things like post-importation activities, maybe specific U.S. health and safety checks, warranty costs that apply only in the U.S., sales discounts offered later, financing charges related to the import, U.S. marketing expenses. Also, sometimes things like foreign inland freight within Taiwan, if it's separately identified, or foreign taxes that are later refunded, or specific interest charges shown separately on the invoice.
So pulling those costs out of the price of the duty is calculated on.
Exactly. The crucial thing is, these costs have to be actual legitimate costs, and you need to be able to clearly identify them and document them separately from the price of the goods themselves. You can't just make them up.
Right. So those are some specific financial or customs tactics. The seminar also talked about broader strategies like value chain restructuring. That sounds more fundamental.
It is. That's about making bigger changes to how and where your products are made and sourced. It's a much larger strategic shift.
And tied into that must be understanding the origin determination rules, right? And knowing where the U.S. considers your goods to actually come from.
Absolutely vital. The materials stressed that different tariffs, different trade agreements can actually have slightly different rules of origin, but they all generally revolve around this concept of substantial transformation.
Substantial transformation, meaning the product changes significantly in a country.
Yes, like taking raw cotton from country A, weaving it into fabric in country B, that weaving process in country B might be considered a substantial transformation, potentially making country B the origin of the fabric for customs purposes.
What factors do they look at to decide if it's substantial?
It's a combination of things. How complex was the manufacturing process done there? What were the key production steps? Where did the most important components originate? What's the ratio of value added or content from that country versus others? And a really common one, did the product's tariff classification number, its HTSUS code, change as a result of the processing done in that country?
HTSUS code. That's the specific customs code for each product.
Exactly. Knowing the HTSUS codes for your inputs and your final product is absolutely step one in any origin analysis. The seminar had some interesting examples looking at how U.S. Customs ruled on the origin of things like smart wearables, robotic vacuums, even breakfast sandwiches, apparently, under different trade rules. It really shows how specific and nuanced these determinations can be.
It definitely sounds like getting the origin right is crucial, especially if you're thinking about moving production to try and avoid certain tariffs.
For sure. And the seminar also gave a quick snapshot of overseas supply chain considerations. Basically, lists of countries that have free trade agreements, FTAs with the US, and countries that have FTAs with China, along with some example tariff rates. It provides a starting point for thinking about potential alternative locations for sourcing or manufacturing and what the tariff implications might be.
Okay, this brings us squarely to the situation for Taiwanese businesses, especially the SMEs, the small and medium-sized ones. They must be feeling the heat from all this.
Oh, absolutely. The pressures are significant. Many Taiwanese manufacturers have, substantial operations in mainland China or across Southeast Asia. These new tariffs, or the threat of them, directly squeeze their profit margins. It makes it much harder for them to compete on price in the U.S. market.
And just picking up and moving production isn't easy, is it?
Not at all. It's incredibly complex and costly. You're talking about finding and setting up new factories, potentially building entirely new supply chains for components, hiring and training a new workforce, changing all your internal processes. Plus, there can be tax implications if you're disinvesting from one location to move elsewhere. And the sheer uncertainty about what future trade policy might look like makes long-term planning for diversification really difficult.
And setting up in the U.S. itself.
Mm.
Probably too expensive for many SMEs.
Often, yes. The costs can be prohibitive. And then, even if they do move or adjust, they face the challenges we just discussed about proving origin. Meeting a rule like needing 20% U.S. content to qualify for something can be a really high bar. Implementing strategies like first sale can also be particularly tricky for SMEs, especially if they have transactions between related companies, or if they struggle with the extensive documentation requirements, maybe across different languages and IT systems.
And the risk of getting it wrong. Penalties from customs.
That's a major concern. Incorrect declarations can lead to significant penalties, back duties, and intense scrutiny going forward. It's a serious risk for these businesses.
So it's a tough spot. Given these challenges, what kind of strategic approaches did the seminar suggest for Taiwanese SMEs? They broke it down by time frame, right?
Yes, into short, medium, and long-term actions. Which makes sense. You can't do everything at once. In the short term, think the next 1 to 2 months, the focus should really be on diagnostics, understanding the impact.
Okay, what does that involve?
It means really analyzing how the new tariffs will hit their specific business model, identifying the exact HTSUS codes affected for their products, checking if any exemptions or FTA benefits might possibly apply. Crucially, clarifying the origin of their products right now, especially for goods that might still have significant Chinese content or processing. And importantly, talking to their U.S. buyers, understanding their attitudes towards potential price increases or changes in supply.
So first, assess the damage and understand the immediate situation. What about the medium term, say 3 to 6 months out?
The focus shifts to evaluation. This is where businesses should seriously investigate the feasibility of implementing strategies like first sale for export or becoming a non-resident importer. Do the potential savings outweigh the complexity and cost for them?
Okay.
They should also re-examine their import declaration values. Can they legitimately use cost unbundling to lower the dutiable value? What other duty mitigation options might exist? Things like using foreign trade zones or maybe duty drawback programs if they re-export goods later.
Diagnostics first, then evaluation of the tools, and the long term, beyond 7 months.
Long term is about execution and strategic shifts. This means actually implementing supply chain optimizations, actively diversifying markets, maybe looking beyond the U.S. and diversifying suppliers. It also involves seriously evaluating the feasibility of relocating some production, maybe to the U.S., maybe to Mexico, carefully considering the rules of origin under the USMCA agreement.
And throughout all this, documentation.
Absolutely critical. Ensuring all transactions are genuine, arm's length where required, and supported by complete, accurate, and readily available documentation. That's foundational.
The seminar got into specific industries too, right? Electronics and textiles, both key for Taiwan. What were the takeaways there?
Yeah, they looked at the potential margin impact. For electronics, assuming a 25% tariff hits, and given that the estimated U.S. production content for many Taiwanese electronics firms with a U.S. presence is quite low, maybe around 6%, the hit to margins could be really substantial, possibly cutting margins by as much as 50% if the company has to absorb the full tariff cost and has minimal U.S. content.
Ouch. So where might they look to move production?
The seminar flagged Mexico, India, and the U.S. itself as potential winners or alternative locations for electronics. Each has pros and cons trade agreements, existing supply chains, labor costs, infrastructure, setup costs, how long it takes to get up and running. It also noted which customer segments are particularly sensitive to price and delivery speed in electronics consumer gadgets, cloud data centers, telecom, and networking gear. And textiles. Similar story.
Pretty similar pressures. The estimated U.S. production content for major Taiwanese textile firms, even those with some U.S. presence, is apparently even lower. Less than 1% was the estimate given.
Wow.
So a 25% tariff there could mean maybe a 20% margin reduction if they absorb it all, perhaps 10% if they can pass some cost on. Again, Mexico, India, and the U.S. were highlighted as potential alternative locations, each with its own profile of pros, cons, costs, and payback periods. And for textiles, the price and delivery-sensitive customers are often in fast fashion or large retail brands.
It sounds like companies really need a structured way to think through these decisions. Was there a tool or process suggested?
Yes, they included a kind of self-assessment flowchart. It guides a company through the steps. Start by analyzing your export revenue, where it comes from, product origins, identify the HTS codes, estimate the potential duty impact, how much will this hurt our margins.
That leads to the big question. Do we need to relocate? If so, or even if not, then evaluate U.S. content levels. Can we qualify for first sale? Can we optimize costs further? And then, if relocation is on the table, assess the suitability of different locations like Mexico or India based on specific criteria.
That makes sense. There was also a point about group enterprise solutions, using transfer pricing. How does that fit in?
Right. This applies more to larger companies with multiple entities in different countries. Transfer pricing is about the prices charged for goods, services, or intellectual property between those related entities. The seminar gave an example with bicycle parts. Maybe the Taiwanese parent company could adjust the price it charges its U.S. subsidiary, or perhaps use the price from its factory in, say, Vietnam as the basis for a first sale transaction into the U.S.
So manipulating the intercompany price to lower the value the U.S. tariff is based on.
Essentially, yes, but it has to be done carefully and be justifiable based on transfer pricing regulations, which are complex in themselves. And making these adjustments impacts not just customs duties, but also corporate income tax liabilities in each country involved. So it's a trade-off and requires careful planning across tax and customs.
Okay. So bringing it towards some final recommendations. What was the overall action plan suggested for Taiwanese businesses?
It was framed again in short, medium, and long-term buckets. Short-term, damage assessment. Run simulations. What if the tariff is X%? What if it's Y%? How does that affect our quotes? And start seriously exploring supply chain diversification option.
Medium term.
Focus on optimizing the proof of origin documentation. Can we make this process more robust, less risky? Also look at using enterprise intelligent automation, using technology to help manage customs compliance, documentation, etc.
And long term.
The long-term goal should be about enhancing product value, moving up the value chain, differentiating products based on quality, innovation, service things beyond just price to make them less susceptible to tariff impacts.
The seminar also touched on the idea of a resilient supply chain, didn't it? What makes a supply chain resilient in this context?
Yeah, they defined it using a few key attributes: robustness, ability to withstand stress; redundancy, having alternatives; resourcefulness, adapting creatively; response speed, reacting quickly; and recovery, bouncing back effectively. And they highlighted the role digitalization, things like AI, IoT, blockchain, can potentially play in enhancing that resilience, providing better visibility and control.
But it also acknowledged that manufacturers face other ongoing challenges beyond just these tariffs.
Definitely. Persistent issues like finding and developing talent, accurately forecasting demand, balancing factory utilization with profitability, the fact that maybe the original advantages of their production locations are eroding, plus challenges in coordinating effectively between production, suppliers, and customers, and often dealing with outdated IT systems that hinder flexibility.
It sounds like there's a real need for operational improvement alongside these tariff strategies.
Absolutely. The seminar stressed the need for comprehensive supply chain optimization, looking at it through a financial lens. How can we enhance competitiveness in our quotes? How can we reduce overall supply chain costs? Where can we find more favorable tax conditions? How do we improve after-tax profits? And optimizing working capital is huge. Managing procurement cycles, purchase to pay, order fulfillment, forecast to deliver, and getting paid, order to cash. Digitalization can help across this entire value chain.
And the concept of lean operations, how does that fit in?
It becomes even more critical when margins are compressed by tariffs. Lean is all about streamlining processes, finding improvements, eliminating waste while maintaining quality. The benefits are clear. Better profits, increased competitiveness, better customer service, shorter lead times. It involves things like just-in-time, flexible work setups, standardized operations, reducing machine changeover times, balanced production flow, using tools like Kanban, automation where appropriate, strong quality control, and really engaging employees in the improvement process.
You mentioned those financial cycles, purchase to pay, forecast to deliver, order to cash. Can optimizing those really make a difference?
A big difference. Managing the purchase to pay cycle helps control how much you spend. Managing forecast to deliver helps optimize inventory levels, not too much, not too little. And managing order to cash helps ensure you get paid faster, improving cash flow. They're all interconnected.
There was also something about product cost and profit analysis framework. That sounds quite detailed.
It is. It's about really understanding your costs at a granular level, defining cost categories, figuring out how to allocate costs accurately to specific products or product lines, and then analyzing variances. Why did raw material costs differ from budget? How efficiently are we using equipment? What's our production yield? How is labor efficiency? Are overheads under control? How accurate was our demand forecast? Did we achieve our production targets? This analysis feeds into building better models for product cost allocation, for setting quotes, evaluating profitability, and making smarter pricing and market decisions.
It seems like KPMG was also promoting their own services to help with this.
Naturally. They mentioned their Enterprise Resilience and Sustainability Deployment Service Blueprint, which seems to cover 4 phases: assessment, strategy, implementation, and reporting. It includes services like impact assessment, cost optimization strategies, supply chain restructuring advice, digital optimization, help with origin proof, and value enhancement planning.
And they ended by redefining the key strengths of resilient companies.
Yes, framing it around 5 core capabilities: foresight, anticipating changes; innovation, developing new solutions; digital capability, leveraging technology; responsiveness, acting quickly; and resilience itself, withstanding and recovering from shocks.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. For you, the listener, especially if you're involved in Taiwanese SME manufacturing, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think the main message is that this new U.S. tariff landscape, driven by the policies we discussed, presents really significant hurdles. There's no ignoring it, but there are strategies available. Things like for sale for export, non-resident importer structures, cost and bundling. These are specific tactics worth investigating, though they require care and good documentation. And more broadly, rethinking the value chain, potentially diversifying operations, maybe considering relocation for some production. These are critical strategic conversations you need to be having right now, especially if you have heavy reliance on China or Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. The key thing for you listening is to really reflect. How do these insights apply to my specific business? What's my exposure? Which of these strategies might be feasible for us? It's about taking this information and starting that internal assessment, weighing the potential benefits against the very real challenges and costs involved.
Exactly. And while the challenges are significant, this deep dive also implicitly highlights the known resilience and adaptability of Taiwanese businesses over the years. They've navigated global shifts before. The current environment certainly demands careful navigation, really strategic planning, and a real willingness to adopt new approaches, maybe embrace digitalization more fully to ensure continued success.
So perhaps the final thought to leave you with is this. Faced with these pressures and opportunities, how will your business, how will Taiwanese manufacturing more broadly continue to innovate and reshape its global value chains in this constantly evolving landscape? Something to think about.